Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Live from the Blue Seats. It's just me, producer JL, here with you today, as Dave is currently on assignment somewhere working, and Rob is probably cutting down a tree somewhere. But no, David and Rob are preoccupied with some other stuff, but they'll be back soon enough, and it's just me here today as I get ready to talk Rangers hockey with you while I watch my football team absolutely implode against a team that I can't stand. If you already didn't know by now, I am a fan of the New York Jets. Please don't feel sorry for me because it's not going to do anything. It doesn't help the fact that Woody Johnson is a terrible owner and nothing that we ever do really works out. So, anyways, talk about hockey. Yes. As I was saying the intro, by the way, I just watched Justin Fields fumble a ball aided by his own lineman that basically his foot kicked the ball out of Justin Fields' hands, and the Patriots got the ball back. So I don't think the Jets are winning this game. So, but anyways, time for hockey. So last time we spoke, last Thursday, was me and Rob. We were hopeful that the Rangers would finally get their first home win against the New York Islanders, but alas, they failed to do so, losing 5-0. But do not be weary, Ranger fans. They were able to finally break out of the curse Monday night against the Nashville Predators. I was fortunately and unfortunately at both of those games. Unfortunately, I was at the Islander game. I left a little early right before the game ended. I didn't want to get stuck in traffic. I normally stay for the whole game, but had to help somebody out. But I was there Monday night when they came back to the Garden and ultimately ended up winning. So they lost the game against the Islanders 5-0, but then they ended up winning against the Predators 6-3. I guess partly in now that I think about it, I if you really want to put it in perspective, I think the return of Vincent Trocheck is huge, and I think that's probably what we're just going to touch on here. But real quick, so since we last recorded the podcast, the Rangers beat the Detroit Red Wings 4-1. They lost to the Islanders in a back-to-back 5-0. They ended up winning against the Nashville Predators, like I mentioned, 6-3, and then they beat the Tampa Bay Lightning 7-3 in a game that was probably one of the most encouraging signs for this team so far. Now, obviously, there's a couple different things that happened between the last time we recorded and now. Outside of the wins, Gabe Perreault was called up. And you also had the return of Vincent Trocheck. And I think, just to touch on Trocheck real quick, is that you finally, especially in that game against Tampa Bay, you were finally able to see what this team looks like with a healthy unit for the most part, a primarily healthy unit. Vincent Trocheck really added some depth to the lines and, really allows kind of everyone to slot back into their original positions that they were at the start of the season. Mika Zibanejad and JT Miller are interchangeable at wing and center from where they're at on the first line. And then obviously Trocheck ends up taking the second line spot with Panarin and Lafreniere. And then Noah Lava sticks to his spot as the third line center, which ultimately at the end of the day really ends up bringing some balance. Now, obviously Matt Rempe is not here because that would ideally really round out this team. But the rest of the players that they have on the roster, whether it be Johnny Brodzinski, Connor Sheary, Uso Parssinen, Taylor Radish, that I mentioned, Connor Sheary, you know, Adam Edstrom, all those Sam Carrick, all those guys can really round out the bottom six, and they've done a pretty good job at it so far. As each player has looked significantly better and more comfortable getting pushed back down into the lineup. So I think that'll really have a huge impact on this team, and you can just kind of tell, especially in that Lightning game. Granted, Andrei Vasilevsky wasn't exactly the best, but I will say that even though the defense was a bit shaky at certain points in that Tampa game and even in the Nashville game, the team just looked better overall. Everyone seemed to kind of be comfortable in their positions. Everyone just kind of seemed to be a little bit more in tune with what they wanted to do. And honestly, with the system that Mike Sullivan employs, I mean, the Trocheck, Lafreniere, Panarin line, obviously with Panarin shaving his head, of course, they looked really good. And I think that line is perfect for a Mike Sullivan type team. um, the system really allows them to not only be strong in their own zone, but basically with the way with Trocheck's quickness down the middle, it allows Lafreniere and Panarin more room to move around. Look, I'll say this: this isn't a knock on Mika Zibanejad, but I don't think Mika Zibanejad and Artemi Panarin are a fit. It blows my mind to this day that they've never really been able to work well together. I think if you wanted to put it together, they've worked well for a total of a week's worth of games, and at one point, that was when the Rangers had Pavel Buchnevich, Buchnevich, Panarin, and Zibanejad. But overall, with Panarin, Lafreniere, and Trocheck coming back together and them looking like gangbusters with Trocheck scoring 2 goals on Wednesday, I really think that this is how it's meant to be, and they look good. I mean, the system's really beginning to shine. Defensively, the unit just generally as a whole, the product looks really good outside of some mishaps here and there. They could probably use a little bit more quickness on the back end, but that's coming later on. With players like Drew Fortescue, Scott Morrow to a degree. Adam Fox is pretty nimble himself, but the Rangers do a semi decent job at moving the puck in and out of their zone and around the ice with the current crop of defensemen that they have. I guess you can kind of say that maybe Braden Schneider or Hovakanainen could probably be weak links, but not every team is going to be perfect, of course. And so another thing that I wanted to know too is that Gabe Perreault looks absolutely fantastic with JT Miller and Mika Zibanejad. I think that is absolutely an ideal way to get this kid going, to see what he has. It was a bit of a surprise when they called him up for Monday's game. But at the same time, though, I think that with the impending return of Trocheck, they really wanted to round out the team. And I noted this on another podcast that we did a couple of weeks ago, before the season started or before when training camp hit. Uh, you want to put certain players in certain positions. I'm reiterating this, of course. You want to put certain players in certain types of positions. So, for example, I noted that when the Rangers were thinking about potentially having Noah Laba start on the NHL roster, um, they needed to put him in a position where he could end up doing the thing that they want him to do and where he can succeed at the most. And that ultimately is him being the third line center. And what did they do? He made the team out of camp and he became the team's third center. He looks comfortable. He looks perfect in that role. It's tailored for him. He took the role and ran with it. And in the case of Gabe Perreault, you're not going to call the kid up and have him play 5-10 minutes a night on a third line with Taylor Radish. No, absolutely not. No disrespect to the bottom six, but a guy like Perreault with his skill set needs to play on the top line. And Mike Sullivan even reiterated that himself when was asked about it. He basically said, paraphrasing in short, that a guy like him needs to play top line minutes. And the results, although he hasn't put the puck in the back of the net, he did register his first NHL point against the Predators on an Alexi Lafreniere goal on a nice break into the offensive zone on a rush. So I thought that was phenomenal. He looked great. Obviously there is going to be a bit of a learning curve, but you know, he looks like this might be the time for him to stay here, truth be told. And honestly, I don't mind that at all. The one thing that Sullivan is really good at is getting the best out of his youth. And I think that with guys like Perreault, and even to the extent guys like Cooley and even Lafreniere, he's going to try and get the most of them as much as possible. So I think it's great that Perreault is getting first line minutes, and the Rangers are honestly doing a sort of a reverse course of what they did in the past with some other type of prospects. Obviously we can sit here and harp on Kako and Lafreniere. I mean, we've talked about this ad nauseum for Lord knows how many times, but ultimately the sentiment remains the same: is that the Rangers back in, even 5 years ago, kind of messed up the development on both those forwards. Now, needless to say, the jury is still out on Lafreniere. He is showing some flashes, and you hope that he can become a consistent NHL producer in Mike Sullivan's system. It's certainly the keys are being handed to him. He's finally being given the time that he needs, especially on the power play. And obviously, with Lafreniere having a little bit more front end skill than Kako is the reason why he's still here. And honestly, if he can produce the way that he can do, and we've seen him do, He had 50 something points a couple seasons ago. You run with that and you take that and you run with it. He may not be the first overall pick that we expected, but if you can get something out of him and have him become a semi decent NHL producer in terms of playing with the guy like Panarin and Trocheck, you take that every day of the week 10 times over as many times as you can. Because Alexi Lafreniere does have the skill. Let's not kid ourselves. The kid is supremely talented. He does have the skill and even the IQ for it. Just all depends on how much he wants to put into it. And so far, it seems like he's beginning to buy into the message a little more. Um, but the Rangers back in the day decided to relegate Kakko and Lafreniere to the doldrums of the bottom six, and ultimately that ended up it hurt Kakko more than anything because I think what it is it with Kakko was sort of this mix of lack of confidence and the skill not translating as much into the NHL level than it did in either juniors or international play. Because obviously Kakko seemed to be physically bigger than some of his other mates. Same thing goes for Lafreniere, but also in some of the TPS Turku highlights, obviously the rink is bigger, so he can kind of do a little bit more. But that's also too, there's also a confidence thing. Uh, Funny enough, David Quinn being back, David Quinn and Gerard Gallant kind of shot this kid's stock value in terms of his confidence and just also his skill in general. And I think with Kako, I think just the way that he plays now, I think that he kind of is a bit lost. He's not really doing much with Seattle right now, and I'm not going to sit and dump on the guy. But I think if he had just been thrusted onto the stage, being put on a first or second line almost immediately, I think that he probably would have. We might have seen some better results. Now, granted, the thing with Kako was NHL standard. He was a bit undersized at some point. He did bulk up a little bit in the couple of off seasons that he was a Ranger, but um, you only got to see flashes of the strong puck possession type of player that he can be, and you don't really see much of that with Seattle. But the point is that the Rangers are doing it the right way by just thrusting Gabe Perreault into the spotlight in his skill set with being a top line player on the first line with Miller and Zibanejad. Once they start clicking, this team will really begin to go places. And obviously, even right now, just the way that they're looking so far, just with everybody back in their right spots, they just look like the team that we've wanted them to look like. And I am very pleased. I know everybody else is. The defense, Will Borgen especially, Will Borgen and Adam Fox have been arguably the two best defensemen on this team. Who thought you would have been able to say Will Borgen was probably one of our best defensemen a couple of months ago? Carson Soucy has done an admirable job. Urho Vakanainen, even though he's been a bit shaky, he's done an admirable job. When the Rangers made those trades with Seattle and with Anaheim, you could kind of tell what Chris Drury was trying to do. And when you looked at the advanced metrics of each one of those guys, you can kind of tell, he was getting players that would fit into a system that was either similar to Mike Sullivan or Mike Sullivan's type of system. And you know, it's working out so far. The team is playing incredibly well, even in some of the losses. Granted, there's some losses that look ugly, but nobody's going to be perfect. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the product has been really good over the last couple of nights, sans the Islander game. And I think that once they continue to really get into the groove with Trocheck being back and everybody being in their proper positions, at least on their lines, I really think that this team will begin to start, putting some wins together. I mean, they've already won 3 out of their last 4. So, and they had that West Coast trip at the end of October into November where they looked really good. Obviously, we know the whole thing about them not winning at home and looking a lot better on the road. But I think now with everything being balanced out a little more, that's going to end up evening out as the season goes along. So this is going to be released on the 14th. You're going to hear this on the 14th. So the Rangers have a back-to-back coming up against the Columbus Blue Jackets and then the Detroit Red Wings before a day off, and then they head out to a semi-West Coast Pacific, more Pacific style trip with Vegas at 10 p.m. on the 18th, Colorado at 9 p.m. on the 20th, and Utah on the Saturday, the 22nd, before coming back home before Thanksgiving on the 24th to play the St. Louis Blues. And then basically the way the rest of the month ends up rounding out is they go to Carolina the day before Thanksgiving. They come they have the Thanksgiving break and then come back up to Boston, and then they play at home on the 29th against the Tampa Bay Lightning. That's a matinee game on a Saturday. So ultimately, this could result in a really good month for the New York Rangers. Just looking at, let's just take a look at December real quick. December seems to be a bit of a tougher month, but there is one night to note in particular. It would be December 15th. That will be the return of Jacob Trouba and Chris Kreider to Madison Square Garden. But it looks like December could be a month where the Rangers can really sort of take off. All these opponents are beatable: Nashville, Carolina, Washington, the Islanders, Vancouver, who they've beaten, Vegas, who I'm sure they can beat, Dallas, Ottawa, Montreal. So if they keep this up, they can really begin to hit their stride. And usually it's around this time of year where they end up doing so. And obviously, we always say that Thanksgiving is sort of that line of demarcation on, when the team, what we can make of the team. And honestly, they look fine. So I think this is going to be a much better outcome uh, for this season than it was last season. And obviously, I might be jumping the gun a little bit, but anything is a lot better than last season, anyways. So that's just kind of a quick discussion on just kind of what happened, the return of Trocheck and the call-up of Perreault, and obviously Bald Panarin seem to kind of all come together, and the team is really beginning to play as a unit. And that's what you want. You want them to really, just kind of start doing that because, we know they have it in them. They do. Mike Sullivan, his coaching has really elevated this team to a level that we really didn't expect, and again, it's not like this team doesn't have talent. This team does have talent. I think us as fans, we tend to devalue our talent a little bit because we watch them every night and we're so hard on them, especially considering the way the season ended last year. But you have to remember, a lot of the players that the Rangers currently have may not be as flashy as some other players in the NHL, but they would still be in big spots on other teams as well. I mean, just look at Chris Kreider, for example. I knew Chris Kreider was still going to be somewhat effective, but at the end of the day, he didn't work out here, but he's still a top flight forward and he is producing for the Anaheim Ducks. You put Mika Zibanejad on another team, let's say you put him on Vancouver, he probably is one of their better forwards over there. I mean, look at JT Miller, same thing, perfect example of that. So there's that. So now let's get to the questions. We have some on Blue Sky, and then also we have some on the blog. Again, thank you everybody for submitting your questions and your comments. We really do appreciate it. Also, thank you to the readers and also the Patreon subscribers as well. You guys are awesome. We appreciate you taking the time out to listen to and digest all our content, all New York Rangers and Hartford Wolfpack as well. So we thank you for that. So this first question, I'm going to read the one we have on Blue Sky because we did put out a post. And this comes from DSAM at DSAM1921. Thank you, DSAM, for submitting your question. And DSAM asks, what is your opinion on Perreault dropping to the third line in the middle of the game, the Tampa game, for matchup purposes? Usually we would be up in arms, but it was justified by Sullivan's statements afterwards. Would you prefer to let this continue, or does it defeat the purpose of having him here? So I don't mind it. If it ends up benefiting the team, obviously the team was working really well, all in all. I don't think this is something permanent. Um, I think the organization really believes in Perreault in terms of having him as one of their guys, and they want to see what they have in him, barring anything crazy where they just end up sending him down or putting in something else. I think that it was just I understand what Sullivan was trying to do. Tampa is a bit more of a tougher team to play against, and Will Cooley can kind of withstand it a little more, and especially this early in Perreault's career, you don't want to get him beat up too much. But I don't think it's something that's going to happen all the time. But also, too, I think that if Sullivan, I'm willing to give Sully the benefit of the doubt. If he thinks that this can benefit the team, then I'm all for it. but I think we kind of get some whiplash when we see some line changes on the ice, and we think that somebody's getting benched. But in truth, it's just a matchup. So I didn't really mind it. I trust Sullivan's instincts on what he's trying to do with the team. They were obviously clicking on all cylinders on Wednesday. Um, if he has to do it down the line, by all means, if it helps the team, but I don't think it's going to be something where if Perreault is playing really well in a game with Mika and JT, and you know, and the matchup is kind of difficult, I don't think that he's going to change it. I think he's just going to kind of do it as he goes. So I didn't mind it too much. Um, and it doesn't defeat the purpose of him being here. Absolutely not. you know, because if it's only for specific matchups, he's still going to get the bulk share of his time on a power play and on the first line, you know. So I don't think that it's going to be something permanent. Unless Sullivan, outwardly states it, then okay, then that's a different story. But um I think that this is just something that Sully is doing just to kind of, help the team, and I don't think it's anything detrimental to Perot. And I think personally, I think Perot isn't going back down to Hartford. I think they're going to, unless Othman ends up kind of changing his narrative, so to speak, then I think that Perot is here to stay. Because if the team is going to be this balanced and this dynamic, Perot has a lot of, quickness. He's very shifty, kind of adds a bit of a layer and dimension to the team. I really think that he's going to stay here. So I think I'm fine with it, just as long as it doesn't become to the point where he ends up getting buried on a different line for the majority of the game, which I don't think will happen. So thank you, D Sam, for that question. I hope I answered your question. I wasn't trying to go around it. I don't think that it's I think it was fine to do that for matchup purposes, and I don't think it's detrimental. And I still think that he's going to get the bulk share of first line minutes with these guys up on the top line. All right. So next question. This comes from long time one time. And long time one time asks, I've watched hockey for a long time. Players always dump the puck in the opposing zone to make a change. Why can't some genius come up with a way to change without giving up possession all the time? And then Dave actually replied to this saying, Occam's razor's simplest answer is to have the puck carrier hold behind the net for the change to finish. It gets tricky in the second period, though, with the long change. So the follow-up question to this is, so why doesn't anyone do it? You can also skate the puck to center ice and pass it back to your goaltender. Complete the change. It's not rocket science. It just takes practice. Then Dave replied, essentially, is you're normally getting pressured. So Dave kind of touched on it a little bit, but I guess the reason why they do it, just dumping it in, obviously, it's because they just don't want to. It's better if you just give it away further out away from you, honestly. You know, um, there are some instances where uh, there are changes where they do have, where the defenseman does stay behind the net, but that's when the team has kind of had possession, so to speak, or like let's say they're in their own defensive zone and they gain possession of the puck and the other team ends up skating out, so they'll go back in. I think honestly it's more about just with forechecks and possession and all that, because if you were to just constantly keep throwing the puck back, some team's going to end up finding out a way to get around that and you're going to turn the puck over more often than not, you know. So because then you end up back skating it or passing it to the goaltender and the defensemen either are changing, right? I mean, you'd have to. There's a lot of timing to it. So if you pass it back and your defensemen are changing, right, or if you're a defenseman, you pass it back and the goalie has to come out, and there's probably only one guy back there, a team can become very aggressive and take advantage of that. It just wouldn't. It wouldn't be conducive in terms of just puck possession, and it would cause a lot of issues. I see what you're saying though, I get it, but I think it's just easier with the way that how quick the game is. You just toss it in, make the quick change, and then get ready to play defense. I think that's more of a safe, effective way to do it. um why doesn't anyone do it? Again, it's just a lot of pressure coming from different teams, and teams will find a way to exploit that. And you know this is a good question, by the way, because it's a legitimate thought, on why they don't just skate it back in. But I think just with the way NHL systems are, and with how detail oriented a lot of teams are when it comes to certain things, I don't think it would be so effective if it were to happen all the time. So I get it, but that's a good question, though. That is a really good question. I actually like that a lot. Feel free to ask more of those types of questions, because those are types of questions that kind of get us to work our brains a little bit. So thank you for that. This next question comes from Sal Merck, and Sal Merck asks, "Will Panarin be a Ranger after the trade deadline?" With the way things are going right now, yes, he will. I think Panarin will be a draft day trade, if anything. Um, or he ends up signing a smaller contract and stays here for like another 3 seasons. Um, Obviously, we know about the off ice stuff, and I'm only speaking about the on ice stuff strictly here. Um, if the Rangers give him an offer that's kind of short term, short salary, he's going to take it. But I don't think I don't think the Rangers are certainly not going to give him $12 million. But if they're even if they're in the spot that they're in right now, just like slightly over 500, I don't think he's going anywhere. So especially with the uptick that's gone on, I don't think he's going anywhere unless something happens between now and February, or now in March, where the team just ends up sinking and they can't do anything and they're out of it, where they're just really bad. Then no, he's going to be here after the deadline, and because the Rangers are going to make a playoff push. This is not a punt season, contrary to popular belief. This was not a punt season. This is a season where they are going to try and go for it. You don't just trade JT. You don't trade for JT Miller, especially trading away two prospect or two young players for Miller. You don't trade for JT Miller to punt the following season. There's a reason why they made him captain. Granted, you can make the jokes about captains getting traded and whatever, but no, Panarin's going to be here. I wholeheartedly believe that, and I think the Rangers will make a run. Thank you for that question. So this next question comes from Midline Shift, and Midline Shift asks, "What do you think Adam Fox's role will be on the Olympic team? Some folks have suggested he won't even make the team, which seems silly to me, but I do wonder where he will fit in. Assuming everyone is healthy, Quinn Hughes will do the heavy lifting offensively. Jacob Slavin will be the shutdown guy. Brock Faber has good chemistry with Slavin at the Four Nations. I'd imagine Charlie McAvoy will play a big role since he was one of the first players named to the team. That doesn't leave much room, and there are plenty other candidates: Zach Werenski, Jake Sanderson, Seth Jones, Noah Hannafin, Brett Pesce, Luke Hughes, Lane Hudson. I would personally take Fox over all of those, but with his struggles at the Four Nations, I will be interested to see where he winds up if and when he makes the team." Okay, so I think Fox is going to be probably one of the team's best defensemen. One of the reasons why he struggled at the Four Nations last season is because he was technically still somewhat injured. The knee injury really sort of lingered all season. It affected his mobility. But also, it's tough to really play that well in a competition of just best on best like that in such a small period of time. You have to remember that the Four Nations things happen in basically the span of a week and a half. And, Adam Fox wasn't the only player that looked, not great. But at the same time, though, it took these guys it had to, the way that they needed to blend together was too quick. It even happened to Team Canada. There was some instances where they looked like total garbaggio. But you know, um, I think he's gonna stand out. He's looked phenomenal this year. He's in much better shape. His legs seem to be under him again. No, not under him, but they seem to be back. In pretty decent shape. It doesn't seem like he's being hampered by that knee injury too much. So I think he's really going to make a strong impact. He's probably more. And look, I'll say this: I think he's either going to be first or second pair. Has to be. I think Adam Fox just kind of gets this, and I'm not saying, midline shift you saying this because you said that you would take him over all those other guys. But I think Adam Fox just gets a bad rap because he's not flashy, right? And I've said this before, but technically sound, in terms of being technically sound, Adam Fox is probably one of the best defensemen in the game because he can defend well in his own zone, but he can also drive offense as well. He has the ability to do that. I don't have to explain Adam Fox's skill set. If you're listening to this, you know what he can do. So I think that he's going to play a big role. I'm going to assume they're probably going to put him with Charlie McAvoy on the second pair because if you put, let's say, Quinn Hughes and if it's not Quinn Hughes and Jacob Slavin, right? Adam Fox already has experience. Second pair is probably going to be Adam Fox and Charlie McAvoy. So those are your first two pairs, and then the bottom three will more than likely, or bottom pair will probably be Zach Werenski and probably, you know, Werenski and maybe Sanderson, maybe Lane Hudson, maybe Brett Pesci. I don't know. But I don't think that Luke Hughes will be considered because he hasn't really been great. If he does, that will be sort of a shocker. But some of those other names too, I think those guys kind of fit on the bottom pair, so to speak, in terms of D. Adam Fox is going to play a big role. And with the difference between the Olympics is they're going to have time to practice because they're essentially going to be gone the whole month of February. So they're going to have time to practice. They're going to have time to get used to it. And also Mike Sullivan, he's already going to have, you know, a couple of months under a Sullivan system. And, that's what they're going to play, for the U.S. Olympic national team. So I think the results now will be a bit better because now it's going to be spread out towards the month of February and it'll give him more time to settle in. I don't think he needs that much time to settle in, but I think with the kind of condensed format of the Four Nations, which I love, by the way, which I can't wait for them to do that again. But then also with him still kind of battling that knee injury, it just didn't really sort of work out well. You're playing best on best, and he's getting thrown out there, and you got, you know, if it's not Connor McDavid, it was Sidney Crosby, or if it wasn't Sidney Crosby, it was Nathan McKinnon, So even the best defensemen are going to have trouble against guys like that. So, um, I think with Sullivan and then also Chris Drury and Bill Guerin and all that, working for Team USA, he's going to be top two. He's probably going to be on the top pair, or he's going to be on the second pair with Charlie McAvoy. I think he's going to make a big impact. I think he's going to shut up a lot of people this year, and he's already done so. So, but thank you for that question. I like that because it kind of gets you to think like, where does he actually fit? And also, I will say this too. I know Quinn Hughes is very good, and I'm not taking anything away from him, but I think I'd even put Adam Fox over Quinn Hughes. You know, Adam Fox, I think, is a slightly better off defensive defenseman in his own right than Quinn Hughes is when it comes to playing defense. But it's not to say that I'm not going to put Quinn Hughes up there, obviously. But heck, you could even put those two on a pair, Quinn Hughes and Adam Fox. Why not? I think that would make for a stellar duo, truth be told. So thank you for that question. We appreciate that. So this next question comes from the Gerard Gallant slander account. I love that name. Thank you again. And so the Gerard Gallant slander account asks, Fox and Gavrikov are phenomenal hockey players, and they've been great overall. But over the last 4 or 5 games, I've noticed some concerning plays that have led to goals against, whether that was getting beat on rushes or misreading shots. This could be a function of how much ice time they get as the top pair, but what is your opinion on playing them 24 to 26 minutes a night, game in and game out, especially when you have a perfectly serviceable second pair with Will Borgen as a defensive stalwart? That's a good question because I've noticed that a little bit too, in terms of them sort of slipping up a little bit. I'm just going to say that this is just part of the process. Um, I think that they're still feeling each other out. Um, Adam Fox hasn't really played with someone like this for a long time. Maybe, before Lindgren really started to break down, it was like that. But I think Fox still has to kind of get used to not having to always be the guy to carry. And it could be where there's a bit of a miscommunication on that part. Now you say, oh, well, they play with each other all the time. But again, everybody's still adjusting to the system. And hopefully with this, sudden surge of balance in offense, that could really kind of calm things down a bit. But I think it's fine that they still play 24 to 26 minutes because they're still, they're still our two best defensemen. Obviously, Will Borgen has looked phenomenal, as I've mentioned earlier, and he's been one of this team's better defensemen. But at the same time, though, it's like if Will Borgen's out there, then Carson Soucy's out there. And this is no diss to Carson Soucy either, because he's also been really good. But if I had to pick between Fox and Gavrikov and Soucy and Borgen, I'm picking Fox and Gavrikov, of course. I think this is just one of those things that hopefully will just kind of smooth over with time. Um, there were some, especially in that San Jose game that they ended up losing, they just looked awful. But then they looked somewhat decent against against the Tampa Bay Lightning. So I think it's just more of still trying to get a feel with each other. And I think once they get comfortable more, a little bit more than before in the start of the season, I think they'll be okay. You know, so I wouldn't say it's a byproduct of time because these guys are built to play for that kind of thing, especially a guy like Gavrikov and Fox. But you know, I think we'll have to just see how they do once the team is really fully formed. So I think maybe just a little bit after Thanksgiving, or maybe going to somewhere in December where they've been able to be with each other a little bit, we can see how they play, not only against better opponents, but just kind of with the same unit, because that really does help. I mean, granted, it's, you can kind of get a read on them just by themselves, but I want to see more. I know what you're saying though, because it has definitely come to mind where they've looked a bit off. The Islander game, they just look terrible. I'll admit that. But I think yeah, I think that they'll be fine. I think playing them 24 to 26 minutes, I think they'll be okay. Because I don't think that also too, I don't think that guys like Borgen, Susie, even Schneider and Vakanainen, and to an extent Matthew Robertson can really sort of handle that extra pressure because I think that would be a bit more of a breakdown defensively than it would be with Fox and Gavrikov. But that's a great question though, because I do see where you're coming from with that, but I think they'll be okay. So I think they'll be fine playing 24 to 26 minutes. They're built for that. So thank you for that. This next question comes from Spozo. Thank you, Spozo, again. How many players on this team will end up being Hall of Famers? Hmm. That's a good question. Um, Eesh. Oh man. Well, wow. Um, I'm just trying to look at the roster right now and see how it goes. I do think, again, speaking hockey only, I do think if Panarin continues to trend upward, and if he ends up winning a Stanley Cup, whether it's with the Rangers or with someone else, I think Panarin is a case. Same for Mika Zibanejad to a degree. Granted, he's not, you know, he wouldn't be, first ballot or anything like that, but by the time his career is over, he's going to be up there. Both of them are going to be up there in terms of points and goals for European skaters. Um, there isn't anyone that I could say that was like a really surefire Hall of Famer outside of potentially Igor Shesterkin. Igor is essentially burning the same path as Henrik Lundqvist, except Lundqvist was a little bit, well, actually, I almost say a little bit, was far better uh, in terms of just getting wins, but it's still kind of early to tell. Also, Igor hasn't had as much postseason, what's the word I'm looking for? He hasn't been able to grind out the postseason with the Rangers as much as Henrik did. Um, I would need to see Igor sort of, kind of see how he would do if he made the playoffs every year and was really put into some really untenable spots, just like Lundqvist was put in. But he is climbing up there, though, and I do think that even if he doesn't get to the point like Henrik did, he's going to play on way better teams than Lundqvist ever played on, at least skill wise. I think Igor could be up there. Fox, I could see if he wins a cup and he just continues to produce the way that he does, and if he has a long and productive NHL career, I could see Adam Fox definitely having a case if he continues it. So I'd say Fox, Igor, maybe Mika, um, and Panarin. Um, if Chris Kreider was here, I would say Chris Kreider. Um, because he would have. I mean, even to this day, I still think if Kreider continues to produce at this clip, even at an old age, I think he can make a case as well. Um, just trying to think of anyone else on the roster. I don't think so. So yeah, I would narrow it down to Kreider, who was here and now is not, Panarin, Zibanejad. And people would think I'm crazy with Zibanejad, but Mika is up there, with points for European forwards. He's been no slouch. He can make a case if he produces a little bit more, but that remains to be seen, of course. Maybe Mika, if he doesn't make the Hall of Fame, gets his number retired by the team, just like with Kreider. Um, I don't think it's fair that we lump Kreider in while Mika's actually been just as maybe even more productive in his time with the Rangers. And obviously Mika's going to be a Ranger longer than Kreider in terms of just, he's here now. Um, so um, so Mika definitely could make a case. So it's Fox, Igor, potentially Mika, and Panarin. And then outside of the Rangers, it's Kreider. So thank you for that question. This next question comes from NYC Crash. What is the realistic expectation for this team this year? They're going to be, I don't want to say middle of the pack, but barring any sort of huge win streak where they're just blowing past people left and right, they're going to probably be third in the division. They're going to fight for a playoff spot. They might squeak into a wild card spot, but I wouldn't expect them obviously to win the President's Trophy, but I think they do make the playoffs this year. So they're going to be middle of the road. And honestly, if you really think about it, that's kind of the best way to do it. You kind of have a slow start, figure it out as the time goes on, and then you really begin to hit a stride at the end of the year, at the end of the year going into the next calendar year, and then you just kind of just run with it from there. So I can see them maybe getting second place in the Metro and probably getting like maybe a 4 or 5 or a 6 seed. Worst case, either they don't make the playoffs or they get a wild card spot. But with just the way that they've been clicking and the cohesion that they've been able to finally put together, I think this team makes the playoffs. So that's sort of a realistic expectation. They're not going to win a division. They're not going to win the President's Trophy, but they're definitely going to be in the playoff hunt. So you would imagine between 4 and 8, or maybe 5 and 8, which is fine, which is definitely an improvement over last season because they didn't make it. So, and then probably what they could win a round or two and probably get, you know, they lucky enough to get into the conference final, win the first round, lose into the second. You know, that's kind of where I see it this year, because obviously we know that this team is currently built is not on paper a Stanley Cup contender. Anything can change, of course, because obviously, we've seen teams who were built worse go farther than some of the talent put on this Ranger team, have been. So because like I said, the 2014 team was probably the best version of what the previous core did. Granted, the 2015 team was essentially the same team to a degree with some tweaks, and they ultimately ended up winning the President's Trophy, but a lot of that was due to Hank. There is more talent. They're a little bit more rounded out, so I think this is going to be more of a team effort than anything. And that being said, you never know what can happen. So maybe these guys end up making a huge run. Who knows? You never know. But if I'm just being realistic off of what we've seen so far, um, middle of the pack in the playoff hunt, probably make the playoffs on a lower seed. And you know what? That's what you want because it's not a punt season and they did what the job that they're set out to do. And then ultimately, what you end up doing if Chris Drury is still here, which I think he will be, is you just build on that foundation. They've changed a lot in the clubhouse. They changed a lot in the locker room and the bench. The attitude of the team is a lot better. Granted, JT Miller hasn't been as productive as we want him to be due to his injury, but I do think that there was a bit of a shift, and I think that they're all playing together as a team now, and they're all buying in, and that's what you want. The team is good enough to do that. So I think, yeah, middle of the pack, but they're going to make the playoffs. And here's our final questions so far, if I can see that. I don't think any other questions came in. I'm just double checking. Nope, I think that is it. So this is our final question of the night. And this is from Nikki70, and Nikki asks us, Drury has two number one draft picks at his disposal. Will he keep them or move them? If he moves them, what do you think he does? Give me your hypothetical blockbuster, even if you combine other prospects' assets. Hmm. That's a good question. Thank you for that. Not that all the other questions are bad, but this one really gets you kind of thinking a little bit. So it's kind of hard to tell what Chris Drury is trying to do. Before you kind of saw the vision a little bit, but it's tough because it honestly it all depends on what ends up happening over the next couple of months. Now, obviously, that sounds like a cop out, but it really does hinge on what ends up happening because if they're not in a playoff spot by the Olympic break, or at least if they're not in the hunt for a playoff spot by the Olympic break, then you'll have to assume that guys like Panarin um, are going to get shipped off. And in thinking about it, that's probably, and maybe Braden Schneider. Those are the only two that you could probably see that will probably get shipped. Maybe Vakanainen. I don't know. I don't see them moving Will Borgen, all things considered. But I think uh, if they are out of a playoff spot, so let me pose this question. Let me pose this to your question. I have to break it into two separate ways because that will affect what Chris Drury is trying to do. If they are in a playoff hunt, and you have to expect that he will probably end up adding to the team. And his trends with the trade deadline lately have been sort of low risk, high reward guys. So you look at it, his first year as GM, he got Andrew Kopp and Frank Vetrano and Justin Braun, which ultimately led to a conference final run. Then he was able to get Vladimir Tarasenko and, ultimately probably against his will, Patrick Kane, and then Nico Mikkola. So it wouldn't be for a huge name. And then you look at the trade deadline last season, basically had, the season prior when they went to the conference final, was they got Jack Roslovic, um, and they got it's Roslovic, and oh my gosh, I feel so terrible. I should know this. Oh man, it was Roslovic and Wenberg, right? Which, to be fair, really did balance them out a little bit. The D pairs, I don't think they really added anyone on the back end. If I'm forgetting something, I sincerely apologize. But and then you even like look at some of the rumored things, the player from San Jose. I'm trying to remember his name. I think it was Barabanov. Is he still on San Jose? You'll have to excuse me for a second. I thought I thought I had this written down, but I don't think I did. Um, yeah, so they were going to trade for Alexander Barabanov from the Sharks. Alexander Barabanov uh is back in Russia, but he was ultimately one that the Rangers were looking at to, you know, bring over, but I something with Mike Greer and using up all his, his spots for like contracts and all that. And um, it didn't really work out. But that was another player that he was trying to get. But it was pretty much Jack Roslovic and Alexander Wenberg for the most part. So if they're in the hunt, you would probably expect them to get another defenseman. Depending on what's available, it's going to be low risk kind of thing. So somebody that could slip on the second pair that's a little bit more defensive. Because if you have Fox Gavr, so you look at the D pairs, you have Fox Gavrikov, Borgen and Susie, and then Vakanainen and Schneider. More than likely, whomever this player is going to slot in on the third pair. So they're not going to trade a bunch of huge assets. If they're out of it by then maybe a couple of smaller assets get dealt. Um, I don't think anyone from the top six gets dealt. Maybe Lafreniere does, depending on his performance. Schneider probably gets dealt. Um, Obviously, Fox and Gavrikov are going to stay. So I think what to go further into your question though, I think with the two first overall picks, I think he tries to make a big swing at the draft. So my guess is either trying to find a centerman that is under contract that a team is looking to try and rid of, which I can't really think of anyone right now because the only one that I could honestly really think of is Alex Barkov, and he ain't going anywhere from the Panthers. I can't really think of anyone else. Jack Eichel signed to that contract, and it would take mountains to move for a guy like Connor McDavid. So there's that. There's also been rumors, not rumors, but just kind of like discussion online that, with St. Louis essentially kind of going out of the playoffs, they can probably look at a guy like Jordan Kyrou. Pavel Buchnevich potentially returns to the Rangers, but then again, you don't want to trade for a winger and block Gabe Perreault or even a Brendan Othman to that degree. Maybe Othman ends up being part of one of those trades, but I think personally, I think what Drury ends up doing is he makes a big swing for Jason Robertson. So I think he lets Panarin walk, or he ends up trading Panarin's rights for picks. That frees up the money. You trade those firsts, one of the firsts, and a couple of prospects, including Brendan Othman to the Dallas Stars, and you get Jason Robertson. I think Jason Robertson is somebody that Drury has been coveted for a very long time. I think that he fits perfectly with what this team is trying to do. And I think with a change of scenery from Dallas to New York, with a couple of more higher octane players, not to say that Dallas isn't high octane, but New York plays a bit of a quicker game than Dallas does. I think that's sort of kind of what Drury wants to do. I think that a trade surrounding Jason Robertson is the trade that you could say would be the Matthew Tkachuk type trade, right? Maybe Alexi Lafreniere ends up moving and the Rangers get another asset from Dallas, because they want to guarantee somebody on the roster. Who knows? It's tough to say right now, but I think that the hypothetical blockbuster would involve Jason Robertson, probably Brendan Othman, maybe another draft pick or two. I don't think Malcolm Spence would be part of it, but maybe a couple other prospects that they may have, along with one or two of those first round picks. Because I think Dallas is definitely going to want some sort of a king's ransom to a degree. My delusional take would be to try to pry Quentin Byfield away from the Kings and kind of get a feel from him to see how he does. Because if he's he's underperforming in Los Angeles right now. But I don't think with Kopitar retiring, I don't think that they're going to trade away, their number 2 overall pick, to the Rangers, all because they're not, he's not playing as well. I think he just needs to figure himself out. But who knows? But I think that, like I said, I think the overall blockbuster would revolve around Jason Robertson. It's just tough to kind of get a feel on exactly. I know definitely we'll know that one of the first will end up going. But the one thing I will give Chris Drury is that he is very good at keeping assets when it comes to making big trades. And I don't think that they'll end up departing with both. I think that they'll end up having to trade the better of the first, and I think the other one they'll just use to pick. But I think that's more of a draft day kind of thing. I think that they'll be in it at the deadline. And I don't foresee any huge moves unless there's an opportunity for him to do it. And he'd be crazy enough not to do it. Like if an opportunity presents itself where he's able to add to the team, obviously, he might try his best to do it and kind of bolster the team. So, but I even those trades, those deadline trades, I don't think would involve a high pick. So considering the way the roster is constructed, so yeah, so I think that big blockbuster deal will happen during the draft or even the off season before rights end up changing. And yeah, I think Jason Robertson's the guy. So all right, so just looking at some of the other comments to see if I'm gonna see if I can find any other questions, but I don't think there is any more. I'm just gonna double check just to be safe. But I think we have ourselves a completed podcast. So thank you everyone for taking the time out to listen to this podcast. I know Dave and Rob had some prior commitments, but we still try to get out a product for you every week. Continue to read the blog, continue to give us your questions, your thoughts. Please, I need an excuse to flame Dave on his crappy food takes. I mean, I know Burger King is fast food, but I don't think it's right to constantly flame it like the way he did when I had a conversation with him one time. Burger King's not that bad, Dave. Come on, give me a break, you know. But yeah, continue. So if you have any food related questions or like any random stuff that we can kind of harp on outside of just Ranger talk too, which we will gladly answer, of course, by all means, we're here to not only talk Rangers, but also just maybe goof around a little bit, because what's the point of doing this if you're not having a little bit of fun, you know? So again, thank you everyone for taking the time out. I want to basically thank, Dave and the crew, Rob, Becky, Nick, and the 30 on Broadway guys, all my compadres who also write for us as well. Hope, Russ, Will, Brandon, Tyler, everyone who contributes to the website. Thank you so much. Um, Appreciate Dave again giving me the opportunity to assist Rob and the crew on this podcast. We've been running pretty strong over the last couple of seasons, and I'm proud of what we've had. And I want to thank you guys, the readers, the listeners, the Patreon subscribers. You guys are awesome. I love the stuff that you guys give us. We appreciate everything that you do in terms of reading, Patreon for subscribing, Patreon subscribers, and just to everyone who takes the time out to interact with us. Thank you very much. We definitely appreciate it. So with that being said, uh, let's see how the Rangers can do over this weekend against Columbus and Detroit, and uh, we'll more than likely have another podcast for you next week. So with that being said, this has been Live from the Blue Seats. Thank you so much for taking the time out to listen. Continue to check out our stuff on the site. Continue to interact with us on socials, and we'll talk to you next week. Oh, let's go Rangers.